Welcome to episode 41 of the MMA Rundown podcast. Obviously, this is coming in a little bit late. The plan was to try to get it in last night, but as I had mentioned beforehand, I didn't think I had a whole lot of time and ended up working out that way where after getting in 2 hours of jiu-jitsu, I was hanging out at the gym a little bit after that, just shooting the shit with a bunch of guys there, so didn't have enough time when I came home, so we're going to do it now. I think a few of these topics are probably going to be topics that wouldn't have otherwise been there had this been a Sunday podcast. I'm trying to keep it at least two last week so that the next coming one that comes up on Sunday is going to be just a lot of the same topics that would normally be there. But there probably is going to be a little bit of overlap here. But the topics that we're going to talk about on this one are going to be the results from the UFC Raleigh event. So that's going to be both a look at the main event and then also looking at the card as a whole. I'll then be looking at the Stephen A. Smith, I guess, controversy, so to speak. I touched on this before, but obviously there have been some updates since then. There was Stephen A. Smith having his rebuttal. Then Joe Rogan rebutted that. Stephen A. Smith just had another rebuttal, which I haven't gotten to yet, and that'll be covered in next week's podcast. So this thing is just going to keep dragging out, which in some ways I guess is good, but in other ways it can be a little bit annoying too and a little bit tedious. After that, I'll be talking about Bellator, the event. I believe it was 238. That was headlined by Chris Cyborg and Julia Budd. We've got a couple different drug charges for some people who have pretty big names in the MMA space. There's Phoenix Jones, who was that I think it was Ben Fodor was the guy's name, brother of Carlos Fodor. But he had fought for World Series of Fighting, but also as a side gig just for fun, he would dress up as a superhero and try to stop crime in Seattle. Well, it looks like he's gotten to the point now where he is committing the crime. Also, Relson Gracie got charged with, or at least was arrested for trafficking a bunch of marijuana. So there's that as well. We've got a very weird ranking that the UFC put out for pound. They eventually fixed it, but they did like this weird mixed pound for pound where they were mixing in men and women, and a lot of the stuff in there just didn't make any sense. So I'll talk about that. Recap the IBJJF Euros, so the European Championships, one of the four major tournaments in the IBJJF season, considered a Grand Slam tournament. So that just took place in Lisbon, I believe. Some updates from the NCAA wrestling season. A lot of Big Ten updates in there, and there's more to come, obviously, with the big Penn State versus Iowa duel coming up at the end of this week. That'll obviously be something I'll talk about on next week's episode, or on episode 42, I should say. That'll be coming out on Sunday. Got a bunch of fights that were announced, and then the last thing I'll talk about is some controversy that came about after Bernie Sanders' account showed Joe Rogan giving an endorsement, and a lot of people were then feeling the need to shit on Joe Rogan, so I'll talk about that as well. So back to the top, it's Curtis Blaydes and JDS, which was the main event of UFC Raleigh. Curtis Blaydes ended up winning this fight in the second round by knockout. I mean, it was interesting in that Dos Santos went way overboard in trying not to get taken down to the point where he just wasn't even going to keep his lead hand up at all. He just wanted to keep it down there to defend. Did a good job with his footwork in terms of not being there when Curtis was shooting. Curtis wasn't able to take him down at any point in this fight. So at least that part of his strategy was effective. The problem for him is that by keeping his hand down, he was just leaving a giant lane open for that right hand the entire night. And I mean, it seemed as though his counters, he was almost a little bit too early on the counters. So it's not as though he was like going for something, but he was just like missing late a bunch of times. It's more so that he was like assuming that Curtis Blaydes was going to fall into a certain position, was trying to like beat him to the spot, and was missing on a few of his big uppercuts. But if you look at the final strikes, Junior really didn't land a whole lot. Only landed 7 strikes over the course of this entire fight. A fight that lasted a little over 6 minutes. So offensively, not very good from Junior Dos Santos. He was completely defensive the entire time. It was clear that he was just going to react to Curtis Blaydes the entire time. I was hoping that in this 5-round fight, that if you catch him once, maybe you put him away, and that's going to be how he has a route to victory. But not a very effective style if the idea is to win. If Curtis wanted to, he could have just drawn this fight out forever and won a really ugly decision. But fortunately for Curtis, and I guess for him, he had a really good corner that was able to say, hey, look, this guy is leaving his lead hand down. The right hand is open there for you all night. You're landing when you're throwing, so feel free to go for it a little bit more often. So Curtis eventually was able to land that big right hand, had Dos Santos hurt up against the fence, then started throwing some big knees. It looks like he broke JDS's collarbone with one of the knees after he'd already stung him with that right hand, which just has to suck for JDS because it looked like he was probably going to be finished either way. So to get your collarbone broken at a point where the fight seemed as though it was likely over already, it's just adding insult to injury. But Blaydes was able to get the win there and get the finish. Afterwards, he was talking about how he wants to have a title fight now. with him being a top 3 guy heading into this fight now on a 3-fight win streak. With a fairly stagnant division at the top right now, I guess he feels like he deserves a title shot. Now, obviously, the reason why his win streak is only at 3 is because 4 fights ago was a fight against Francis Ngannou, who hasn't lost since then either, and Ngannou won that. So obviously, Ngannou should have the precedence over Curtis Blaydes for a title fight, especially if he gets the win over Rosenstrike. If he loses to Rosenstrike, you're probably not going to give him a title fight coming off of a loss. But if he gets that win, he definitely has to get that ahead of Curtis Blaydes. It would also suck for Blaydes because Blaydes is 0-2 against Ngannou. So even if Stipe, who it sounds like his eye injury is getting better, it does sound like there is some progress. But assuming, let's just say that wasn't the case and they decided to put up an interim title fight, even still, it's tough to sell Blaydes versus Ngannou 3 at this point, especially with Blaydes only being on a 3-fight win streak. So for Curtis, I mean, even if, I guess if Rosenstrike wins though, Rosenstrike's going to be on a longer win streak. So even then, he has an argument to be made that he should get the next title fight. So I don't know that things are going to work out for Curtis in terms of him getting a title fight. But it sounds like for him, he's still willing to fight for a number 1 contenders fight if that's what's available to him. So we'll see what happens with the heavyweight division if they do match up DC and Stipe. Then I guess for him, he possibly gets the winner of that Ngannou versus Rosenstrike fight, as long as the winner of that fight is A, willing to take the fight with Curtis Blaydes, but then B, feels that it makes sense for them to do so. Like I feel like Rosenstrike might be willing to take that fight, but if he feels like he's got a title fight locked up, he might just hold out and wait. And if it seems like fans are more interested in a Rosenstrike title fight than a Curtis Blaydes title fight, then he may not even need to fight Curtis Blaydes to earn a title fight once that availability is freed up. Looking at the rest of the card, in the co-main event we had Rafael dos Anjos versus Michael Chiesa. Pretty surprising how this fight went. I didn't expect Chiesa to be able to out-wrestle dos Anjos and fight him in this manner. To me, I figured, at least on paper, that RDA was the better striker. Really good Muay Thai, really good leg kicks. Really good when he's moving forward. But on the ground, very high level jiu-jitsu. Now, granted, he's at his best when he's in the top position. Not that he's bad off of his back, but he's a lot better on top. But you figured with a fight like this that he'd be the one walking Chiesa down, and that for Chiesa, it'd be tough for him to consistently take him down without like getting caught in some Kimuras or caught in some positions where he has to kind of reset and get back to the middle. But the problem is that RDA really didn't do a good job of holding center here. He had his back up against the fence for much of the fight. Landed some good shots when Chiesa was coming in, but after he'd sting Chiesa, he really wouldn't be able to separate, and then Chiesa would eventually be able to take him down on the ground, get to a good position, and be able to rack up some points and win the round. So for Chiesa, really big win for him to have. It's frustrating to watch RDA because you feel like he has the skills to beat Chiesa, and he has the skills to beat Chiesa pretty cleanly. But if you're going to have your back up against the fence, and you're going to give Chiesa a chance to find some positions where he can win for the time being as the clock ticks, it's going to put you in a tough position, and obviously RDA loses here. Kind of crazy to think about with RDA being a former lightweight champion and Chiesa being a lightweight at the time, that had RDA versus Chiesa happen when RDA had the belt, like, does this fight look a lot different? Like, is the RDA we have now a whole lot worse? Is the Chiesa we have now a whole lot better? Or given the right circumstances, like maybe on like a late notice injury, could Chiesa possibly fought RDA when RDA was the champion? Could Chiesa have potentially been a champion? It's sort of like a crazy thing to think about because I've never looked at Chiesa's skill set that way, but for him to get a win like this over RDA, it's sort of like a weird thing to think about. But with that being said, after the fight, Chiesa then called out Colby Covington. I mean, it'd be nice for Chiesa if he got that fight, but I don't see how it would make any sense for Colby. Colby's in a position right now where if he just wants to ask for an immediate rematch against Usman, I can see that fight being made. I know Dana White wanted to make the fight with Tyron Woodley. I don't know how the results of Tyron Woodley versus Leon Edwards is going to affect that. If Edwards wins and you have Woodley coming off a loss and you have Colby coming off a loss, that could make sense. If Edwards loses, does Tyron then get a title fight? I guess that remains to be seen. But then maybe you put him in there with Leon Scott, as he says. So to me, it feels like Colby has a lot of better options ahead of him, especially given the heat that he has with a lot of the top guys in the division. So I don't really see Chiesa being a fight that he's going to take. Not only is the guy lower ranked than some of the other guys that Colby could probably fight, but there just isn't really like an actual heat there. Like it seems like Chiesa from afar doesn't like Colby or doesn't like his gimmick, but it's not as though the beef between Chiesa and Colby is anywhere close to like the beef between Chiesa or between Colby and Tyron, or Colby and Jorge, or Colby and Kamaru for that matter. So don't see that fight being made, but can't fault the guy for trying, I guess. Fight before that, we had Alex Perez versus Jordan Espinosa. Perez winning by arm triangle, which was a pretty bizarre finish for him. He must have a ridiculously strong grip. Because from the position that he had it sort of reminded me of the Brian Barberena versus Sage Northcutt choke, where it was sort of like this modified Von Flue choke from top of half guard. Obviously, there was enough pressure to put the guy out. It's not as though Espinosa like tapped to like discomfort. Like he didn't tap and he got choked unconscious. But there's obviously enough pressure on the right side where that was like directly on the neck. I just didn't see how Perez was going to be able to get enough pressure on the side with the arm in, but apparently he had enough of a squeeze and was able to kind of like tilt his neck in and do enough to close off that side and close off that carotid artery and eventually put Espinosa out. So really impressive win for Perez. It was a fight between, I believe, 11 and 12 at flyweight. Perez possibly jumps into the rankings now at this point. I haven't looked at flyweight yet to see where he's at now, but in a division that looks like the UFC is working on reloading right now again, getting a win like that definitely goes a long way for you. So he's got to be pretty happy about that. Fight before that, we had Hannah Cifers versus Angela Hill. Not the most entertaining first round. On the feet, Hill was definitely getting the better on the feet, had a longer range, but didn't really seem like her shots were stinging all that much. But in the second round, was able to get a trip, put Hannah Cifers down on her back, got straight into side control. Then as she was trying to advance to mount, got caught in a half guard, but Cifers wasn't able to get control of the knee. She just kind of had control of the shin, so it ended up being under like a quarter mount. And then from there, Angela landed a couple nice shots, was able to advance to mount, kept a really high mount, which was good work by Angela, and was just landing a ton of unanswered shots. And eventually, the ref had seen enough and decided to stop the fight. We had Jamal Hill getting a unanimous decision win over Darko Stosic also. And in the prelims, we had Bevon Lewis with a decision win over Declan Townsend. Not exactly the most exciting fight. Arnold Allen versus Nick Lentz. It was a pretty close fight. I think when you look at the actual strike numbers, you can make an argument that Lentz won that fight just barely. But watching it live, I felt like Allen definitely had enough of a lead where he should have won that. And all three judges agreed. 30-27, 29-28, and 29-28. So every judge gave it to Arnold Allen. There was a pretty nasty eye poke that went unpunished. I mean, obviously things happen really quick and it's hard to catch it from every angle. So it's not as though the ref was like trying to do Nick Lentz dirty, but it was just something that he missed, and it seems like that could have also had an effect as well. But Lentz is a pretty decent all around guy. He's a scrappy guy. He's not a guy that's easy to blow through. So you feel like all of the guys who are at the top of the division are gonna find a way to get through Lentz and make it seem somewhat easy. Arnold Allen wasn't able to do that, so I think at least there may be some questions on whether or not Allen's like a future title contender, as some people might think he is. But he needed to get the win there. He got the win. You can't blame him for that. So for him, he still got time to work. He still has time to improve, and I'm sure he will. Then Justine Kish was able to get a win over Lucy Pudilova. We had Montel Jackson beating Felipe Corrales. Just absolutely put him on him. All three judges gave him at least one 10-8 round. One judge gave him two 10-8 rounds. Sarah McMahon with a dominant win over Lena Landsberg. We had Brett Johns in a really exciting fight with Tony Gravelli. He was able to finish him by rear naked choke. And then on the first fight of the card, Herbert Burns was able to catch Nate Landwehr with a knee up against the fence after he'd been backed up against the fence himself. So that covers it for UFC Raleigh. Next thing to talk about is going to be Stephen A. Smith. I've decided that I'm going to put some clips in here so we can actually hear what Stephen A. Smith said and then what his actual response was. So the more I listen to what Stephen A. Smith said on the post show, the less upset I am with him. I still have disagreements with what he said, and I'll get to that after I play the clip. But when you compare what he said and compared, even on the desk, like what you're going to hear in this clip is right before they get to Stephen A. Smith, Michael Bisping's also going to be pretty critical of Donald Cerrone as well. So let me pull that up right now for you.
And from there, Cerrone, I'm not saying he gave up, but he was mentally defeated and he fell out of his league.
And what I'm saying to you is, if you notice, ultimately, he got out of the clinch. Step back, gather yourself. The man's got over 50 fights in his career, for crying out loud. You know how to fight. We've seen you. We've seen 17 submissions. We've seen 10 knockouts. Excuse me. Step back and go like this. Okay, he caught me with the shoulder. I'm a little bit rattled right now. Let me catch my bearings. Let me catch my breath. I'm not even a fighter, and I know this. Come on, y'all. Right. You guys fought. I did it. This guy knows better, and somehow, some way, you're in there with Conor McGregor. I'm gonna tell y'all something right now. He never had a pay-per-view event before. He hasn't been a champion. It could be that the lights were a little bit too bright.
Yes.
I covered sports for a quarter century, not this sport, but sports, and there's been plenty of examples that I've seen guys when the bright lights get brighter, palms get sweaty, backsides get tight, and you can't find dudes. Whatever they are, they don't show up that particular night. That's what happened to Cowboy Cerrone tonight. He didn't show up, period, and I don't understand it.
Well, and that A in Stephen A. Smith most certainly doesn't stand for amateur when it comes to mixed martial arts. There's a lot of truth in what you're saying.
Gotta say, John Anik with the A doesn't stand for amateur, and there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. I think it's funny that of all the takes that people have had on this, no one's really brought up John Anik validating Stephen A. Smith there. But if you listen to what he was saying, first off, he's saying that it was like this is Cowboy's first pay-per-view. That's obviously not true. Cowboy's may have had other big fights. He's had some big fights on other pay-per-views. Has he been a champion before? No. He's been pretty close to that level, but has lost in those title fights. And again, like I'd mentioned in past episodes, like I don't buy into the belief that Don Cerrone can't win in the big fight. I think a lot of times, if he wins a fight that at the time appears to be a big fight, people sort of downplay it over time. But if he loses, then people sort of build those fights up to be bigger than they were. So when he had that main event loss to Leon Edwards, it felt like people were building that up. When he had the main event loss to Darren Till, it seemed like people were building those fights up as being bigger than they were at the time. But when he had the big wins, like the main event win against Ali Quinta, the win against Ben Henderson, when Ben Henderson was arguably one of the top guys at lightweight at the time, I mean, it's not as though people were... It's not as though those weren't big fights. Those were definitely big fights at the time, too. But it feels like over time, people are now thinking of the Bellator Ben Henderson, like, oh, but it's Ben Henderson. But you kind of forget how good Ben Henderson was at the time and where he was ranked at the time. Even with Ali Quinta was number 4 in the division at the time. And had Ali Quinta won, it seemed as though there was a lot of momentum where people felt, hey, look, he was kind of competitive with Khabib in that fight. He didn't even know he was going to be fighting Khabib. He was preparing for a 3-round fight with Paul Felder, who's a much different fighter. So maybe with a full camp, he might get a better fight out of him. And had he gotten through Cowboy, there's a possibility that fight would have been made. Now, granted, given the other guys who are at the top division, do I think that's the decision that would have been made in the end? Probably not, but that was something that was being talked about heading into that fight. But Cowboy was still able to come in as a lower ranked guy and get a really big win and a dominant win over the course of 5 rounds. But Stephen A. Smith just saying that Cowboy just didn't show up, saying that Cowboy didn't... I guess the big point that Stephen A. Smith was making here was that he feels as though once Cowboy was hurt, he didn't do a good job of trying to recover and get away. I don't know what fight he was watching. Cowboy did exactly that. So what happened was Conor comes in with that straight left hand. Cowboy ducks underneath and kind of gets into a good position where he can kind of shoot for a takedown. But as Conor's forward momentum was coming in, his left leg and kind of like his left thigh right above his knee slammed into the side of Cowboy's head. So then Cowboy kind of had all his momentum stopped and then went up into a regular clinch. From that clinch, McGregor did a good job of tying up his arms, threw the shoulder strikes, threw a knee on the exit, and that knee is what broke open the clinch. Obviously, if you're Cowboy, you're not going to fight to stay in the clinch after you eat a knee like that to the head. So Cowboy broke away from the clinch and then was backed up. Obviously, he was backed up against the fence. If you remember when he took that head kick, he was behind the black line. So he was backing up and trying to recover, but Conor was just staying on him, doing a good job of heading him off with his footwork. Cowboy throws the head kick to try to get Conor off him. Conor blocks it, returns his own head kick, and then at that point, Cowboy is hurt and is just covering up while Conor's just picking him apart and finding his openings and eventually gets the finish. So again, I don't really agree with Stephen A. Smith's point, but it's not as though he was like so far out of line. And that clip that we started with, we had Michael Bisping questioning Cowboy showing up in the big fights, and he's like, well, I'm not saying he quit, but the effort could have been better there. We have John Anik being like, yeah, Stephen A. Smith, like, a lot of what you're saying is true, I agree with you. But it just seems like a lot of the people who are upset with Stephen A., they're upset because he's criticizing a fighter that they respect, and they feel like he doesn't have, like, enough time in MMA to warrant him doing that. And to me, it's annoying. If the guy's got a good point, he's got a good point. If he's got a bad point, he has a bad point. Like, you can argue on the point that's being made without having to, like, make a giant deal about the person himself. So it feels like a lot of people are just really quick to attack Stephen A. Smith because he's this guy who's known for being a hot take artist. He's a guy who's known for covering other sports. And so I think for that reason, people really wanted to get on him. But when you have a guy like this, a guy who's a major star at ESPN, going out of his way to cover an MMA fight, though I don't agree with a lot of what he said, it's not as though his points were drastically different from a lot of other people in the MMA community. I mean, there were people who were saying a lot of the same stuff that he was saying. Even Jimmy Smith, I felt like at times was even more harsh on Donald Cerrone than Stephen A. Smith was. But because Stephen A. Smith's coming from the outside, then people feel like they have to just like rip on him. But it's sort of weird for the sport where you want to be recognized as a global sport. You want to have more of like a mainstream appeal, but then when a mainstream personality comes in and starts giving their takes on it, you just start shitting on them, and you're like, oh, go cover something else. Just don't cover us again. Don't give us your attention again. I don't find that to be very useful. But then after that, there was a podcast with Josh Thompson that Joe Rogan started off just ripping into Stephen A. Smith and saying that he shouldn't cover the sport and just kind of going off of a lot of that similar stuff. So Stephen A. had his response, and I will play Stephen A.'s response right here.
Mad respect to Joe Rogan. Nothing but respect for the man and the tremendous work that he has done and will continue to do throughout the years and for years to come. But you're wrong on this one, my man. Me, Stephen A. Smith, me being at the Conor McGregor fight against Cowboy Cerrone, saying what I said that he didn't show us much in 40 seconds, that warrants. It's not good for the sport. It's not good for me. It's not good for ESPN. First of all, as it pertains to ESPN, check the numbers. The subscribers to ESPN Plus, the level of attention that it got, the traffic that it generated in digital and beyond. Check the numbers, number one. That's not just because of me, that's because of you. Because of Ario, because of Chael, because of Michael Bisping, and everybody else associated with it. Check the numbers, number one. Not good for the sport? I think that's good for the sport. I certainly don't claim to be the aficionado you are or anybody else covering this sport, but excuse me. I have been a reporter for 25 years. I have covered sports on a variety of competitive levels, regardless of what the sport is. That includes boxing and the UFC. And I don't give a damn if I did it. It don't take much to look at 3 shoulder shots to the nose that Conor McGregor gave Cowboy Cerrone, watching him fold inside of 20 seconds, knowing that he only got 1 strike off, and oh, by the way, that was blocked by Conor. It doesn't take much to look at the fight and say, excuse me, I didn't see enough to convince me that Conor in a rematch against Nurmagomedov, that wouldn't cut it. Or in a fight against Masvidal, that wouldn't cut it. Because that's what you judge greatness by. It's not just the fight that they're in, it's who they're about to go against. What are we talking about here? We're talking about Conor McGregor against one of those 2 guys potentially next. So you look at him and you say, excuse me, did I see enough? After such a long layoff, losing to Nurmagomedov, and before that an exhibition boxing match against Floyd Money Mayweather. Did you see enough? Hell no, we didn't see enough. Nothing wrong with that. I stated that night. I stated again. I'll state it next week, next month, next year. I stand by that. And I don't think disagreeing with that position warrants the kind of criticism that came in my direction. Having said that, you're entitled. You have your right, just like I have my right to respond, as I'm doing right now. But anytime you want to talk to me about this fight, or you want to talk to me about my credentials to discuss something in the world of sports, name the time and place, Joe Rogan, I'll show up. It's not a problem. It's not a problem at all. You don't know me, so I'm not going to knock you for speaking out the way you spoke out without calling me what I don't care about all of that. I respect where you're coming from. You're just wrong on this particular one, and I'm telling you you're wrong. Conor McGregor did not get the opportunity to show us enough for us to believe Nurmagomedov or Masvidal, that's something that could potentially happen to them. I didn't see it because Cowboy Cerrone in his first pay-per-view match folded. I respect him, but he folded like a cheap tent. Period. Bad night for him. That's all. I stand by that. I'm going to still stand by that. I'll holler at y'all later. Joe Rogan, if you need me, you know where to find me. Later.
All right, so that's Stephen A's response right there. And like it's sort of hard because this isn't like a black and white thing where like Joe's all right or Stephen's all right. Like each of them have their own points. Again, that was another example of Stephen A. Smith talking about how this is like Cowboys' first pay-per-view ever. Again, that's not the first pay-per-view he's been on. So that point isn't there. Also, the talk of Donald Cerrone folding like a cheap tent. I didn't see the clip where he said that he was a quitter. I heard some people talk about that. He did say that he didn't show up when the lights were there. Lights were there. Let's just assume that he did say he was a quitter, and I don't know that he did. We know for a fact he said that Cerrone folded like a cheap 10 because obviously he just said it right there. Look, here's the thing. When a fighter suffers a serious injury and they continue to fight through it, part of the reason why that's so respected is because we understand that that's not always going to be normal. So we've seen fights where someone breaks a hand and they decide, okay, that's it, I'm out. So you have kind of like a Brian Bowles or an Anthony Pettis situation. And do you blame them for not fighting through a broken hand? Not exactly. I mean, it makes sense. Obviously, having a broken hand can severely limit your options in a fight. Then you have other examples where someone will break both hands and then they'll just find ways to throw elbows and keep fighting through. Kind of like what Uriah Faber did against Mike Brown. And then in that way, you sort of respect and appreciate more what had happened there. With this Cerrone fight, and again at the time we didn't know that he had broken his nose and we didn't know that he had broken his orbital. He sort of made a decision that when he was up against the fence, though he was rocked and that needs to be understood as well. When he was up against the fence, it's not as though he was looking to reach out and like try to get into a clinch with Conor and kind of recover there. It's not as though he was like trying to get to some kind of guard position and then control his posture and recover from there. He wasn't making any effort to really improve his position. He was just kind of covering up and sitting against the fence, and it seemed as though he was pretty much just waiting for Herb Dean to get in there and stop the fight, which he eventually did after about 10 seconds of unnecessary damage. So to that end, it seems as though Cowboy was hurt, kind of realized, look, I think my orbital is broken, I think my nose is broken, this isn't going well for me, I'm kind of rocked, like, I'm done here. And that's respectable, I don't see an issue with it, but there obviously have been fighters in the past who will break their orbital, they'll break their nose and they'll continue to fight through it like nothing else, like nothing happened. So for fans, I think when they see that, they think of those fighters who fight through just absurd injuries and find ways to keep going through. I'm sure Stephen A. Smith, whether it's been boxing or the MMA fights, has seen fighters fight through some stuff like that. So to see that and say, hey, Cowboy was still there mentally, he still had his consciousness, and it's not as though he was doing everything he could to improve position at risk of losing his consciousness completely. It seemed as though he was at a point where he still had some consciousness. Potentially could have had some options to go for, even if they could have made things worse for him, but had some options to at least like try as a last ditch effort to salvage the fight that he didn't do. It was more so he just kind of covered up and waited for the ref to get in. So I can see why some people would make that observation. Again, I wouldn't call that quitting. It's a normal part of the sport. But if that's what Stephen A. Smith saw and that's what he wanted, if he wanted to call that folding like a cheap tent, I mean that's a rough way of putting it. I don't think it's fair to most fighters. I don't think it's necessarily fair to Cowboy to say that. But I can see why he would feel that and why he would say that, even if the rhetoric's a little too sharp, as far as I'm concerned. So to me, I read what Joe Rogan said. It was on the Frankie Yeager podcast. Again, I'm going to have to listen to that one. I just got through the Kamaru Usman one. So I'll be able to hear what Joe says in full, and I'll recap that on episode 42, which will be on Sunday. But I think at this point, for the MMA fans and the MMA media who just want to keep on crapping on Stephen A. Smith and talk about why he shouldn't be covering the sport, just grow up. Like if you don't like his takes, that's fine. There are plenty of people in the MMA space who have similar takes, though. So if you're going to give a similar energy to them and their takes in terms of your disagreement, okay, that's fine. But if you're going to just go way over the top because this mainstream guy is coming in and giving those same takes, it's annoying and it's not really helpful. So the people who've been writing articles, people who've been trying to make big YouTube videos talking about it, I don't find what they're doing to be very helpful, and in some ways it almost feels as though it's coming from a point of jealousy where they don't like someone coming into the MMA media space, getting a spot on a prime show like what Stephen A. Smith has, and being able to spread his opinion there when they feel like maybe they deserve it more. Maybe there's some jealousy to it. I don't know what it is. But to me, do I agree with his takes? Not entirely. Do I feel like he deserves to just be completely ripped on, told that he doesn't belong in MMA, shouldn't ever do it again? It's a bad look for him, bad luck for ESPN. That's just way over the top. Like, not everyone's going to have perfect takes. Not everyone's going to have wonderful takes. Even in the clip that I played from Stephen A. Smith from the initial thing, he was saying, look, I'm not a fighter. Like, this isn't, like, my main area of expertise. He was talking about how Cowboy has I think 17 submissions and 10 knockouts or whatever the stat he pulled up was. I'm not sure if that was completely accurate or not. But basically what he's saying is, like, I understand that Cowboy's done a lot of great things. I'm not an expert, but given what I know, I was still able to see this, and then he made his claims from there. So it's not as though Stephen A. Smith is trying to pretend that he has, like, the same level of MMA knowledge as, like, Anderson Silva or Conor McGregor or, like, John Kavanaugh, Greg Jackson. Like, he's not pretending that that's where his knowledge base is at. He's kind of telling you on the desk what he knows about the sport, and then just is giving his takes beyond that. So, to me, I would like to see Stephen A. Smith continue to cover MMA. Don't know when he would be back next. Maybe that could be versus Tony Ferguson fight would probably be one that would make sense in terms of being a mega fight. Seems as though he's kind of at a point now where he's only really coming around for the really big ones. So maybe we'll see him then. Hopefully this doesn't discourage him. Hopefully, even though he's had a lot of negative energy pointed towards him, it's also given him a ton of attention. This sort of pseudo feud with him and Joe Rogan has been pretty entertaining for him. It's gotten him a lot of impressions on social media. So maybe he feels like, even though there's been a lot of negative energy towards him, he sort of thrives off of that, and he doesn't necessarily mind it. So I hope that he doesn't feel discouraged and like he should never come back to cover it again. I would like to see him come back and cover it again, even if I disagree with what he's saying. I like to have him there. He's a superstar in the sports media world. So we'll see how this develops. We'll see if it ends up leading to a Stephen A. Smith and Joe Rogan podcast, which would be amazing. Hopefully they would go 2 or 3 hours with that. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe they just kind of take their shots from afar and end it there. But I would like to see Stephen A. Smith continue to cover the sport. Next thing to talk about is going to be Bellator 238. Main event on that card was Chris Cyborg versus Julia Budd. It seems as though the division at 145 in Bellator isn't a whole lot deeper than it is in the UFC. In the UFC, they have Nunes sort of just kind of popping up and down from 135. They have Felicia Spencer, Megan Anderson, and that's about it. It seems with Bellator, they've got Julia Budd. They've got Kat Zingano, who's going to be popping up from 135. And it seems like that's about it. So Cyborg got the win over Julia Budd here. What was the better striker? Sort of got a vintage Cyborg performance, still kind of throwing a lot of those wide punches, and that was what got her in trouble against Amanda Nunes, is that Nunes was throwing straighter and was quicker to the punch as a result. Budd wasn't really able to stay in the pocket and find her shots as well as Nunes was, obviously, and as a result, Budd took a pretty rough beating until she was eventually finished in the 4th round. So Cyborg gets the win here, gets a nice little chunk of change, although I think Budd made over $350,000. Not sure what the gate was for this event, but I have a feeling that they spent a lot more on fighter pay than they did on the gate. So maybe they're getting some decent money from DAZN. Maybe they're getting some pretty good money on the TV contract, but it seems as though shows like this aren't the most sustainable thing for a business, but they did put some decent money into it. In the co-main event, we had Adam Boric versus Darren Caldwell. Boric was undefeated, coming off of a really good win against a better wrestler than Caldwell in Aaron Pico. So I kind of figured that after that performance, with how he was able to defend takedowns, even when he did get taken down, he was able to get up pretty easily. I figured that with Caldwell, he would be a little bit more successful, but ends up exposing his back a little bit as he was trying to get up after Caldwell got him down. Caldwell was able to slip in behind him, get a really tight rear naked choke in there, was able to finish him. So give Boric his first loss, and Caldwell is now on to the semifinals. We had Juan Archuleta versus Henry Corrales. Archuleta, coming off of a loss against Pitbull, was able to get back in the win column here with the unanimous decision win over Corrales. And then Sergio Pettis making his Bellator debut against Alfred Kashikayan. Pettis just had a really violent finish here, rocked him on the feet, was laying some big shots on him. Alfred was somehow like finding his way back up to his feet, even though he was rocked and was still taking more shots. But obviously his neck was exposed when he was coming up. Pettis jumped on a guillotine, was able to choke him out unconscious from there. On the prelims, Aaron Pico was able to get back in the win column. He got a win over Daniel Carey, who was 7-3 coming into the fight. So not exactly bad competition. AJ Agazarm was going up against Adele Altamini. Here it says the submission was an armbar. I'm pretty sure it was the choke that finished, because it was like it's a setup I like to use a lot. I usually don't finish it the way that he does, although I kind of like what he did. Where when you go for an armbar and someone's locking their hands, I know in EBI they call this spiderweb position. But when you're in that position, if someone's got like a really tight grip or you feel like you're going to have trouble prying their arm out, you can slip the leg that's on the hip side. If you have one leg that's closer to the head, one leg that's closer to the hip, if you kind of understand what I'm saying. If you take the side that's closer to the hip and feed that through, you can switch into a triangle. So he did that, and then pulled the forearm there to tighten it. There might have been some pressure there on the shoulder, or maybe it was the pressure there that got the tap, but it looks as though the choke was pretty tight too. But either way, Agazarm gets the win there after struggling early on in that fight. But it still seems like AJ just doesn't have a lot of power in his hands, and that's going to be a really big problem for him, both in terms of him being effective on the feet, but also in him really giving fighters something to worry about, where they have to worry about the strikes, which ends up opening up the wrestling for him. So it seems as though just the major lack of striking is going to be a big issue for him getting to his game. Yes, he's 3-1 now, but that first loss really wasn't all that great. Yes, he's shown some improvement since then, but it hasn't been a whole ton. It looked like he was in danger of taking a loss here prior to eventually getting the finish. Some other fights to note: Curtis Millender also was on this card, made his Bellator debut in the prelims and got a win by unanimous decision. Next topic to talk about from there, we have a couple different drug charges. So I'll start with Relson Gracie, actually. So Relson was coming from California and had a bunch of marijuana on him, got busted in Brazil. You would figure in most cases, especially in Brazil, especially with Bolsonaro right now, who I don't believe is very keen on illegal drugs, that this could have been really bad for him. But being Brazilian royalty probably helped him a little bit as well. But they got him off, saying that it was for medical use. So for him, it looks like he's not going to be facing any charges or anything at all. It seems like the case has just been thrown out. So good for Relson Gracie. You would hope anyway that he's not going to get in any trouble for having much marijuana on him. I don't think too many people are all that upset about someone having marijuana, even if you're against marijuana. I feel like most people, even like among conservative Republicans, I don't know if they feel as though you deserve to be like locked up in a cage for it. It's just more like they feel like marijuana is for people who are losers, or they feel like it's for people who maybe aren't all that motivated in life, and that it's just not a very useful drug to take. So it's good that Relson isn't being locked up for a long period of time, and hopefully he can kind of get back to whatever he's doing and not get caught for something like this again. As for Phoenix Jones, he got in trouble on a drug trafficking charge that has not been resolved yet. So we'll see where it goes from there. But with him, he was sort of a fun story a while back when he was getting these really cool stories written about him, where he was helping fight crime in Seattle, and then he'd go in and fight for World Series of Fighting. Never really got a ton of traction as a pro MMA fighter. Had some wins here and there, had some losses here and there, but it's not as though he ever like built himself up into a position where he could really contend for a title there. Eventually he got released. Had that weird fight where he was fighting his brother out at a time as well. So for him, it seems like life hasn't exactly been as good as it looked as it's not as good as it looked like it could have been a few years back. So fortunately for him, he's facing these charges. Hopefully for him, a lot of the good work that he did back when he was Phoenix Jones and he was fighting crime, maybe the judge will go easy on him. We'll have to see where it goes from there. Next topic is going to be the pound-for-pound rankings that were released by the UFC. So I've brought this up a couple times in the past, where they already have had a mixed pound-for-pound ranking, where they'll mix in some of the female champions in there as well. So if you looked at the pound-for-pound top 15, like Amanda Nunes would be in there. You'd have some other guys in there. And a point I had made in the past is that I thought this was stupid to begin with, just because the idea of the pound-for-pound ranking is that, all things being equal, like who is the best overall fighter, and it sort of becomes an argument based around skill largely. But kind of one of these things that goes with pound for pound is that if you have two guys in the same weight class and they fought, like you wouldn't really see someone who's ranked below someone at their weight be ranked ahead of them at pound for pound. So I found it weird that Amanda Nunes would be ranked ahead of like a bantamweight champion, or ranked ahead of a lot of the top male bantamweight contenders, because technically she's also a 135. Like the idea of Amanda Nunes being ranked ahead of Aljamain Sterling, I think it's crazy, because I think Aljamain Sterling would beat the shit out of her in a fight. But it seems as though because she was the women's champion, that she was then put ahead of him and all the other bantamweights who were below her, sometimes even including the bantamweight champion. So that was my issue with them mixing the pound for pound rankings to begin with. For whatever reason, they decided that they wanted to really go into mixing it to the point where Jessica I believe, was number 12 in this new pound for pound ranking, which is just absolutely absurd. So it seemed like there were some people, kind of like myself included, who on the initial pound for pound rankings was like, this is kind of stupid. Why are we mixing the women in here, especially given the skill disparity that there is right now. By them doing that new mixed ranking, they just got all it just really drove home the point that I was making before. So a lot of fans really ripped him for it. So they decided to scrap that and then switch to a women's only pound for pound and then a men's only pound for pound. And I think that's where it should have been in the first place, but that's where it is now. So hopefully it stays this way. I mean, granted, pound for pound is a stupid argument anyway. It's not like it's something you can ever really prove. I also find it kind of weird that in MMA and especially in the UFC, like they'll tell you what the guy's rankings are heading into a fight, but they never really use the pound for pound ranking. Like you'll know where someone's ranked in their division. Like even if you have a guy like Conor McGregor moving up to welterweight, it'll say like number 3 lightweight fighting up against Donald Cerrone, and then have his ranking too. But they never really talk about the pound for pound rankings, which is kind of interesting. Even with the top guys, it seems as though the reason they don't talk about it is because whenever there's a John Jones fight, you can sort of pretend, well, I guess John Jones is the top pound for pound guy. Then Khabib comes up again. Well, actually, come to think of it, Khabib. So I guess by them not including the pound for pound rankings and having like a solidified number, maybe they can make this guy's the top pound for pound promo on more than just one guy. But it seems out that they have those rankings, but they really don't use them all that much. Next topic to talk about is the IBJJF Euros. So as I had mentioned in the preview, this is one of the biggest tournaments in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gi grappling. I'll just start with the results at black belt. So, bit of a surprise. They had Bruno Malfacini, who is just multiple, just absolute legend at roosterweight. He was in this bracket, but so was Talison Suarez, and they met up at a point where whoever lost wasn't even going to make it to the medal stand. Talison was able to win this match. So Talison ends up moving on, eventually gets to the finals, going up against Tomoyuki Hashimoto, who I believe is based out of, well, obviously, I'm trying to, I think it's Team Carpe Diem, but a Japanese team, officially with Brasa CTA, but Hashimoto was able to get the win here over Talison Suarez, which was a bit of a surprise to everyone. I think everyone figured if Talison was able to get through Bruno, then he was going to be able to win it all. Unfortunately for him, was not able to do so. At light feather, Mikey Musumeci, who is a multiple-time world champion, just won it at roosterweight this year, which was kind of surprising that he was able to make the weight cut down there, but wanted to win it at a new weight, but he was able to make his return here. He also fought in the open weight, which was just kind of ridiculous. Fought some really big guys, had some wins that were some big guys too, but he ends up winning his division here. At featherweight, Isaac Dordeline was able to win that. At lightweight, Giannatis Gracie was able to win his division, beat Vitor Oliveira in the finals, which is a really big win for him. Oliveira is pretty much winning every single Master Worlds that he's in, so definitely one. You could argue he's the best black belt grappler at that weight, over 30, but still able to compete with a lot of the best guys under 30, but wasn't able to get the win here against Giannatis Gracie. At middleweight, Tommy Langaker was able to win this bracket. Ronaldo Jr. was also in that bracket. I believe Langaker was able to beat him in the semifinals. At medium heavy, Manuel Ribamar was able to win that division. At heavyweight, Keenan Cornelius was able to get the win over Adam Wardzinski, who had just won the No-Gi Worlds. But Keenan was able to get the win over him here in the gi. And at super heavy, we had Patrick Gaudio winning that division, beating Felipe Andrew in the finals. But Felipe Andrew eventually would be able to get to the finals again in the open weight, and that ended up working out pretty well for him. But before I get to that, I'll also mention ultra heavyweight, where Igor Schneider was the winner. But a couple of big names in taking bronze there with Muhammad Ali and Tanner Rice. But then at the open weight class, Felipe Andrew was able to catch an armbar on Keenan Cornelius going off of a triangle, and then switching the armbar as Keenan was escaping the triangle. And Muhammad Ali also made it to the podium here, finishing third. So that covers it for the Euros. As for college wrestling, I think it's pretty safe to say that this is the biggest dual week of the year, because we got Penn State versus Iowa, and that's really the duel that everyone wants to see. I think at this point everyone's under the assumption that the champion this year is either going to be Iowa or it's going to be Penn State. Iowa right now is ranked in position where it looks like they're going to do it, but Penn State's one of those teams you can never count out. They have a lot of guys on their team who can make some deep runs and score a lot of points. So it's not as though this meet's going to tell us who's going to win in March, but it's still going to be a good opportunity for Penn State, especially with some of their guys like Aaron Brooks. They're going to have some opportunities to really work their way up the rankings. Shakur Rashid again, he'll have a chance against Jacob Warner, assuming that Warner goes out and wrestles. He'll have a chance to work his way up the rankings, and if Penn State gets some big upsets here, it's definitely going to affect the rankings to a point where it's going to make things easier for them moving forward, but also really open people's eyes to the possibility of Penn State closing the gap and beating Iowa. But Iowa did just have a meet against Ohio State. The notable results there were a bunch of number ones here that were competing there. So for Iowa, they had Spencer Lee. went up against a backup. Not that it mattered. He usually wants to Malik Heinzelman, but ended up beating Ohio State's backer pretty easily. Wasn't a number one at 133, although lost him to Santos number 2 and has beaten the number 1 guy already. But he had a dominant win after getting taken down quickly. He was just able to run through Jordan Decatur. At 141, we could have had a match between number 1 and number 3 on Flow's rankings. But that guy number 3, Max Marion, who's been injured all year, who's been like wrestling with a sleeve and also like a shoulder brace, wasn't able to compete there. And it sounds like he's not going to be competing for a little bit. And it seems like they're going to give some time to recover, or he just re-injured himself and just has to be off and can't be wrestling right now. So Iowa's backer went out there. Carter Happel ended up losing pretty badly to Luke Pletcher. At 149, Iowa had the number 1 guy in the nation with Pat Lugo. Lugo was much more aggressive in this match, was in a lot more shots than Sammy Sasso was. Sasso was really never close to taking him down. Lugo was incredibly close to taking him down a couple times, but never was able to finish. But in the rideouts, Lugo wasn't very effective in holding down Sasso, and Sasso was really good at keeping Lugo down. So in overtime, Lugo wasn't able to ride out Sasso, but Sasso was able to ride out Lugo, and so Sasso got the win there. At 157, not a whole lot to talk about there. Caleb Young got the win for Iowa, 65. Alex Marinelli, number 2 guy, who is 2-0 against the guy who's number 1, Vincenzo Joseph, although we'll get that match this weekend. But he got his win. Michael Kemmerer got his win. 184, good win for Abe Assad against Rocky Jordan. 197, could have had a 1 versus 3 or a 1 versus 4, depending on where Jacob Warren is ranked, but he didn't go out and wrestle against Colin Moore, the number 1 guy. Instead, Cash Wilkie went out there. Wilkie's had some decent results at 197, although he was making 184 for much of this year. But he was never close to taking down Colin Moore, was just trying to avoid giving up bonus points. And then Anthony Cassiope was able to beat Gary Traub in the heavyweight match. So, as I mentioned before, there'll be plenty to talk about for college wrestling heading into the next episode when we actually have the Penn State versus Iowa results. And I'm sure based on what happens there's going to be a lot of predicting what's going to happen in the future and trying to figure out how that's going to affect seeds, and if it shows us that Iowa really is that much better than Penn State, or if it shows us that Penn State's been really good all this time, we've just been underestimating them. So I'm sure there's a lot that'll be read into that, and I'll be happy to do that myself. And last point, actually we have a couple more points to talk about. We have the fight announcements, and then I have another quick one on Joe Rogan. So for fight announcements, a few big fights were announced between the last regular podcast I had and this one. So not including the Q&A podcast that I did on Thursday. So we have Derek Brunson versus Edmund Shabazian. Really interesting for Edmund Shabazian. Seems like he's being given a similar road to Israel Adesanya, where Adesanya was given Brad Tavares, then given Derek Brunson right after that. Then he went Silva, Gastelum, and then Whitaker. Shabazian was given Tavares, had a better finish, or had a more dominant win than Adesanya did there. Now he's being given Brunson. Don't know if they're going to give him Silva, Gastelum, and then Whitaker out right after, but if he's able to sort of follow in similar footsteps to Israel Adesanya and continue to look more impressive than Adesanya did, you'd have to think that Shabazian's going to get some really good opportunities and he's going to get them really quick. So this fight could really launch Shabazian forward into the top of the division to the point where he might be facing, whether it's sort of like an Anderson Silva equivalent, where it's a really big name guy who maybe isn't ranked at the top right now anymore, or whether he's just going to be given a top contender. That remains to be seen, but this seems like a really big opportunity for him. We have Anthony Rocco Martin versus David Zawada. Seems like a pretty solid prelim fight that's probably going to be put together. But Rocco Martin's always an interesting guy to watch. We've got Anthony Smith versus Glover Teixeira. Kind of a bummer because it feels like Anthony Smith's at a point now where he's not too far away from a title fight. Even though he did get absolutely run over by John Jones, you would figure, based on his result against Alexander Gustafsson, that he'd be given another guy who's looked at as a top contender right now, or if he gets the win, then maybe he jumps in there. But I guess just in terms of everyone who is already taken, the Glover fight made the most sense for the UFC, so that's the fight they put together. We've got Michael Johnson versus Evan Dunham, which would have been a banger at lightweight like 5 years ago. But that fight's being put together now. And we also have... Actually, you know what? I think that's probably it for the notable ones. All right, and then the last thing to talk about is the Joe Rogan and Bernie Sanders controversy. So effectively what happened is Joe Rogan had a podcast with a guy named Jimmy Dore, who is just a left-wing political commentator. While he was on that podcast, he was talking about how he feels about some of the top candidates for president on the Democratic side, and he said that Bernie was the one that he liked the most, and so they felt like Bernie meant what he said, and so he he found him more likable. And he had a podcast with Bernie and liked him from that podcast. So then Bernie's team ended up clipping that, putting it out on social media, and Bernie's in a spot right now where it looks like he's got a pretty good shot to win the nomination, or at least be competitive. It looks like he's got a decent chance to win Iowa and New Hampshire as well. So a lot of people in media who would not like to see that are going out of their way right now to discredit Bernie. And with that being the case, and with him using Joe Rogan as like as a celebrity endorsement, I guess they felt the need to try to chop down Joe Rogan by proxy with him being affiliated with Bernie Sanders now. So there were a lot of articles about how Joe Rogan is sort of like this gateway to the alt-right, and he's this awful cage fighting commentator, and just a lot of really lazy character attacks on him. I like that Joe Rogan didn't even like address it. With that being said, would it be nice if he did? It's sort of frustrating just listening to Joe Rogan's podcast oftentimes, because depending on who he's talking to, he'll say a lot of things that come out of his mouth. They don't exactly. I'm trying to think of. There's just a lot of inconsistency. Like, if he's talking to a right wing person, like he'll be quick to talk about how New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, how often they get things wrong. But then if he's talking to someone more left wing, he'll like tout the fact that he's a paid subscriber to those. Well, obviously not paid subscriber to CNN, but like a paid subscriber to the New York Times, paid subscriber to Washington Post, and how much he like appreciates them. And so you have another example here where they're clearly wrong and they're attacking him personally, and you sort of like to see him like go out publicly and say, hey, look, like I'm a paid subscriber to you guys, like I expect better out of you. If I know you're screwing up something this badly on something that I'm confident about and I know a lot about, how can I trust that you're going to be right about things that I'm not too knowledgeable about? So it would have been nice for him to kind of push back a little bit more than he did, but I think for the most part the MMA community kind of knows who Joe Rogan is. They appreciate from what he is, and that's about where it stands. Granted, there were some articles where people were like kind of building off them, be like, well, Joe Rogan actually does bring some bad voices onto his platform. He kind of does have some bad tendencies, and for the people who are doing that, like just like they can screw off. Like I think for the most part, regardless of where you stand politically and who you support, I think for the most part most MMA fans are cool with Joe Rogan. Even with him getting attacked by some of these news outlets that some people view to be credible, even with that being the case, I don't think Joe Rogan's reputation took too many hits here. So I think for the most part, I was happy with how most fans handled it. I think for the most part, most fans stuck by Joe Rogan and felt as though he was being attacked unfairly there. So I appreciate that. And for the ones who felt like they had to sort of mirror some of the things that were being said about Joe Rogan just because he was endorsing Bernie Sanders, I mean, they're, you know what I mean? I mean, people see what you're saying. So if you're gonna give up on Joe Rogan and try to like rip on him for having a bunch of people with different opinions on a show, that says more about you than it does about him. So I guess that's really about all I need to say there. So that covers it for this week. As I've said in past weeks, and I guess that's all I'll continue to say. If you like the podcast, your best bet's gonna be to subscribe to it. So if you subscribe by audio, then obviously it'll automatically download it into your phone. So in this case, maybe you're expecting it on Tuesday, you didn't get it. Now it's Wednesday night. I'm not sure if this will come Thursday morning or late Wednesday night for you, but either way, if you're subscribed, it'll automatically come to you and automatically be downloaded, so you can listen to it whenever you're ready. If you're subscribed to me on YouTube, and in all likelihood, you're going to see, you'll probably see it in your homepage on YouTube. If you click the notification bell, then you'll just straight up get a notification and know when each new podcast is. So if that works best for you, you should probably do that as well. So appreciate everyone for listening. I'll be back pretty soon, in a few days for Sunday. Not going to be any big MMA events to recap, but there will be some big college wrestling events to recap. I'm sure there'll be some more news to talk about. At the very least, there'll be some more advancements in the Stephen A. Smith drama. So I'll follow up on that as well. And hopefully there'll be some good fight news. And obviously with UFC 247 coming up, there'll be a preview for that as well.